Değerli katılımcılar, TÜSİAD ve Chapter Zero Türkiye işbirliğinde gerçekleştirilen OECD Sorumlu İş Yönetimi ve Avrupa Birliği Kurumsal Sürdürülebilirlik Durum Tespiti Webinarı başlıklı etkinliğimize hoş geldiniz. Açılış konuşması için sözü TÜSİAD Yönetim Kurulu üyesi, Enerji, Çevre ve İklim Değişikliği Yuvarlak Masası Başkanı ve Chapter Zero Türkiye Yürütme Komitesi Başkanı Cevdet Alemdar'a bırakmadan önce etkinliğimizle ilgili birkaç konuya dikkat çekmek isteriz. İngilizce dilinde gerçekleşecek etkinliğimizde İngilizce-Türkçe simultane çeviri hizmeti bulunmaktadır. Zoom uygulamalarınızda tercüme kısmından bu hizmete erişebilirsiniz. Moderasyonu TÜSİAD Avrupa Birliği ve Business Europe temsilcisi Dilek Aydın tarafından yapılacak etkinliğimizde sorularınızı yine uygulamada yer alan soru-cevap bölümü üzerinden yazılı olarak bizlere iletebilirsiniz. Şimdi sözü açılış konuşmaları için Sayın Cevdet Alemdar'a bırakıyorum. Cevdet Bey, the floor is yours.
Distinguished participants, in the contemporary global landscape, it has become clear that the objectives of corporates must extend beyond profit maximization. Today, businesses bear a responsibility to proactively address the significant challenges that our society and planet face. The idea of corporate sustainability encourages companies to incorporate social, environmental, and economic factors into their business strategies and also daily operations. The responsible business conduct principles by the OECD and the ongoing dialogues regarding the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive highlight the increasing global focus on responsible corporate conduct. These initiatives establish a crucial framework for companies to align their actions with sustainability. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Winand Kwadwilik. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Perfect.
Mr. Kwadwilik is the director of VNO-NCW EU office in Brussels, permanent delegate to Business Europe, and chair of the Responsible Business Conduct Committee at OECD. Today, he will provide us his valuable insights into OECD's responsible business conduct and offer important insights which are also under negotiation among the EU institutions. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Alemdar. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be invited by TÜSİAD, and I'm looking forward to the discussion also with the members who are in the webinar now. So what I intended to do is to start with an introduction, telling you something about, as you mentioned, the OECD guidelines and then also the legislative agenda in the EU. And that afterwards, then I'm open to answer questions and to further elaborate on the subjects. So you mentioned already in your introduction that the business landscape is changing and that apart from profit maximization, there is more and more a demand from business also to take care of other societal impacts of business activities. And these demands are all part of the responsible business conduct agenda. And there are a number of developments taking place. And the first development that I would like to discuss with you is the review of the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct. The OECD guidelines are an old instrument. They have been created in the 70s, so they are about 50 years old, and roughly every 10 years they have been updated. And the last update is just finished in last June, and we were very much involved in this process for the last 2 years. I'm the chair of the investment committee of BIAC, Business at OECD, of which TÜSİAD is also a member, and Business at OECD was the business partner in these negotiations. The OECD guidelines are the international reference document for responsible business conduct. It is an equilibrated, balanced text with a very important principle, and that is that the guidelines are voluntary. They are recommendations from governments to business on how to behave, but they are not binding. In fact, the guidelines are based on two principles. The first one is that business should avoid adverse impact when doing business on a number of societal issues. And basically, there are 10 chapters in the OECD guidelines, and they are about human rights, about social policy, about corruption, about science and technology, about the reporting. So 10 different chapters. And apart from avoiding adverse impact, the guidelines also expect business to do due diligence. And due diligence basically means that when you are active as a company in a certain country, that you do not only look at the risks for yourself, because that is part of the normal financial due diligence, but that you also take care of possible adverse impacts of your operations in the country. So it's due diligence not on your own risk, but on the risks to others. And those are the two guiding principles: avoid adverse impact and do due diligence. And then on the basis of that, since 2011, when this element was introduced in the guidelines, we have seen an enormous development in international business to start taking into account due diligence and to develop policies there. And the guidelines are still voluntary. Also, in the last review, the voluntary principle was maintained. But what we see, and I come to that afterwards, is that now, and in the US and also in the EU, a number of legislative initiatives are taken to make due diligence also mandatory, binding. So maybe it's good also to briefly discuss what BIAC, Business at OECD, has done in this process. We have, for about 2 years, we have been first taking part in the so-called stock-taking exercise. That was the preparation for the review, together with the trade unions and NGOs and the member states. And then since the summer of last year, we have been, for 1 full year, we have been negotiating the new text. The new text maintains, as I said, the basic principles. So the document remains voluntary. And also what is very important is that the document establishes a very clear difference between responsibility for what you do yourself and as a company and what other companies in your chain are doing. And also what is very important in the due diligence guidelines, in the OECD guidelines, is that there are a number of provisions dealing with proportionality and prioritization. So the guidelines recognize that if you have a very complicated supply chain with many, sometimes thousands of suppliers, that you cannot immediately take care of every risk that might be hidden somewhere in the chain, so that it is logical and acceptable that you choose as a company your priorities on what risks to concentrate first and then gradually develop. What is new in the OECD guidelines in the review that has been agreed last June is, in the first place, that the guidelines, the due diligence has been extended from the supply chain, so basically the upstream chain, also to the downstream elements. So it's now the complete value chain and not only the supply chain. That is a big difference. We have been very much opposing this as BIAC, but the political climate in the member state was such that we couldn't avoid that the decision in principle has been taken to extend to the downstream. But on the other hand, we have been very effective in limiting it. In the first place, we have succeeded that consumer relations were not included. We have also included that it should be about the foreseeable use of the product, so not every use. And we have also stressed explicitly once again that proportionality and prioritization and also the recognition that there is a difference between what you do yourself as a company and what others do, that has been recognized. So the extension to the downstream chain has been mitigated by our efforts, but it has not been completely avoided. And I think that is something which is very important for companies, that there is a fundamental extension from the supply chain part to the downstream part in the OECD guidelines. And that will certainly have increasing consequences in the coming years. So the process in the OECD is now finished. It's over. The document has been accepted by the Assembly of the OECD at the beginning of June, and the new guidelines are now in force. They are active. And that means, I think, for Turkish business, that there is a direct effect of the OECD guidelines, because Turkey is a member of the OECD. But there is also an indirect effect in the sense that when Turkish companies are part of value chains of other companies in other countries, that they will also be approached by partners in the value chain to ask to take into account the new OECD guidelines. So it means substantially that there is a real change. One of the biggest discussions during the review, and that is the link also with the next subject that I would like to treat with you, is the linkage between the OECD guidelines and EU legislation. Because we were worried that once the OECD guidelines were reviewed, that there would be a political call to say, well, the EU legislation has to be fully in line with the OECD guidelines. And there we have said from the beginning that is not a realistic proposition because the OECD guidelines are voluntary. The EU legislation is going to be mandatory, and an openly formulated and sometimes vaguely formulated norm, voluntary norm, cannot simply be translated into a legally binding norm. So there was a lot of discussion about that. Also because in the OECD guidelines, for example, on environment, many new details have been introduced. And in itself, that text is reasonable and acceptable for a voluntary guideline, but it creates great complications if you make it a mandatory norm. And that is why in the discussions in the OECD, it was in the end agreed that there would be in the opening paragraph, in the preface of the OECD guidelines, there is now an explicit statement of purpose saying that the OECD guidelines are voluntary, that because they are voluntary, they can be aspirational, they can be very ambitious, but this ambition is not meaning that it is also legally binding, and that there is a difference between the OECD guidelines and what may be legally binding in certain countries, and that the OECD guidelines is not a template for legislation. So in that sense, we hoped to combine two things, which is being ambitious on the OECD level and at the same time avoiding problems with mandatory legislation. Now that brings me to second part of my introduction, which is the legislative developments on the EU level. In the EU, there is a very strong push in many member states and also on the EU level itself by the Commission and by the European Parliament to introduce stringent responsible business conduct legislation. And there are at least 4 very important initiatives in this respect. There is the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, which is about due diligence and which is directly linked as a subject directly linked to the OECD guidelines. There is a new reporting directive called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. There is a regulation on deforestation, and there is a regulation on forced labor. And there are also other initiatives, but I will concentrate now on these 4, and especially on the due diligence directive. It is important to note, I say it once again, that this due diligence directive on the European level is mandatory, so it would create liabilities and also the possibility for administrative fines if a company is not in line with what is agreed in that directive. And that makes it, of course, very important that what is agreed, that it is very carefully formulated. Now, in the EU, the process is still ongoing. It is not finalized. And the discussion is sometimes complicated by the fact that there are now 3 versions of the due diligence directive on the table. There is a proposal by the Commission. There is a report by the European Parliament. And there is a general approach agreed by the member states in the Council. And the process stage which we are in now is the trilogue. The trilogue is the discussion between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission to come to one common final position. The discussions are ongoing. They are politically very complicated, and we are playing also via Business Europe an active role in that process. From the beginning, Business Europe has said we are in principle constructive towards creating European rules in this field, because there are problems in the value chains which must be addressed. And the most effective way to address it is on the European level, because then you put 27 countries together, and that means that you have a weight also in international relations and in international negotiations. And the alternative is that you would have national initiatives in 27 EU countries. And at the beginning, it was already said there is a law already active in Germany. There is a law active in France. There is a proposal for a law in the Netherlands. There is a proposal for a law in Belgium. And these proposals and laws are all different. And that creates big problems. And if the other 23 countries would follow, it would lead to a completely unmanageable and unacceptable situation, because this matter is intrinsically international. Responsible business conduct is about doing business in other countries. And it would not only for European companies be an unsurmountable problem if there would be 27 laws, but also, for example, for Turkish counterparts or for Malaysian counterparts or for Brazilian counterparts. If a European company would have to say to a partner in the chain, well, I would like to buy your products, but you have to comply with these 27 laws, which are, I know, contradictory, which are, I know, complicated, but still you have to comply to it. That's an impossible situation. So that, as we have said, we want European rules, but they must work, they must be effective, they must be workable, which means that they must be, it must be possible for companies in practice to comply with them. And they should create a level playing field within the EU, but also between European companies and non-European companies. And I think that last element is also of particular importance for Turkish companies, being in many instances partner companies for European companies and being active on the European market as well. So that was our basic input, and we are now in the middle of the discussions, and there are a number of very serious concerns still. One concern is about the material norms, so basically what you have to do and what you have to avoid as a company. These material norms are not sufficiently clear. Sometimes, for example, in the environmental field or in the human rights field, it is not exactly clear what is expected from companies. Now, that is also the case in the guidelines, in the OECD guidelines. But there again, in the OECD guidelines, which are voluntary, you have more possibilities to think to do what you think you should do as a company. And if it would not be according to the recommendation, then there can be a discussion in the national contact point, and then you can change. But if it is a mandatory law, it would immediately lead to fines or to civil liability. So the material norms in a binding situation must be much more clear from the beginning, beforehand. There is also a discussion going on liability. The Commission proposal wants liability deep in the chain. So basically, it does not make the difference between what you do as yourself as a company and what a partner is doing in the chain. That is not in line with the OECD guidelines, and we think that's a very bad element in the Commission proposal. Luckily enough, in the European Parliament's proposal and in the Council's proposal, there is a clear distinction in liability between own acts and acts of others. So that is a positive thing. There are also a number of concepts in the EU proposal. For example, what exactly is adverse impact? What exactly is expected in due diligence? Who exactly is a stakeholder? What exactly means stakeholder consultation? So there are a number of unclear points. We are in the middle of the discussion. We hope that in the end we can come to an agreement. That would mean that the positions which are on the table now should be substantially changed still. But I think in principle, the possibilities to come to an agreement are there. We have still a number of months to negotiate, so we will see where the discussions will go. And again, what does this mean for Turkish businesses? I think in the first place, Turkish businesses which do business in the internal market of the EU, they will be asked to comply with this legislation. So it's important. And also Turkish businesses that are in the chains of European companies that are supplier in some way to European companies. And it may be a very substantial supplier, but it may also be a tiny and a limited supplier. Still, companies would have to comply with these rules. And in that respect, it's very important also to note that formally, the proposal is only about big companies. But in our view, that is misleading because this directive will demand from all big companies, if they want to be sure that they comply with this directive, then they should ask from all their suppliers, also the small ones in their chain, to comply with the demands of this directive. So in practice, this directive will not only touch upon big companies, but it will touch upon every company in the chain, and there are a lot, of course, of Turkish companies also in the chains of European companies. So this is basically what I would like to present to you as an introduction, and I'm looking forward to the questions and to further discussion.
Well, Brennan, thank you very much for your lucid presentation, very structured, and not just about the processes, the important processes of RDC and due diligence on EU level, but also about the logic behind the business's arguments and the main principles. So they are crucial in the process ahead of us. Well, I mean, we're following the debate on EU level due diligence for the last 2 years, and we're still rediscovering critical details of it in every debate. Shortly, I will open the floor to questions to draw on your experience further. Our participants can submit their question in the Q&A section on the control bar below. And to give our audience some time to type in their questions, I also would like to share some of our experiences on the Turkish business side. Well, you know also very well, Turkish private sector is highly engaged in the sustainability efforts and also following very closely and contributing to the EU level policy making and discussions on green and digital transition, but more broadly on the sustainable development objectives. Here we do this through, of course, together with BNO as well, under the roof of Business Europe, but also in Brussels directly with the Commission. We are collecting the inputs of our members and contributing to the processes on EU Commission level and in the European Parliament and Council in the member states level as well. And ESGs are already embedded into the corporate governance of our businesses, but as you just explained, this is a dynamic adaptation process. We're witnessing a lot of changes on both national level, on OECD level, and on EU level. So you already also mentioned how we are highly interlinked when it comes to EU and Turkish businesses. And due diligence, as you mentioned, is an international subject essentially, but there's also a unique relationship between EU and Turkey that makes the issue even more critical for Turkish businesses, because the due diligence is one aspect, but there are also a lot of overlapping reporting requirements and new legislative framework on the EU level, which will have direct impact on Turkish businesses as well, where the roots of this unique relationship is surely first and foremost the customs union agreement between EU and Turkey. And therefore companies are highly integrated in the EU value chains, and Turkish businesses implement the EU rules and standards at times even further than what is legally required on national level because of the strong economic partnership. There is also on the official level ongoing legislative alignment due to the candidacy status of Turkey to the EU membership, and of course due to the regulatory cooperation under the customs union. And Turkish businesses continue to promote alignment with the EU acquis, primarily when it comes to green and digital transition and new industrial standards in Turkey as well. As a matter of fact, we believe due to the geopolitical and geoeconomic developments, we need to deepen this economic partnership in the period ahead, and we believe this would support the resilience of broader European value chains. Therefore, together with Business Europe, we have an urgent call to launch the update of the Customs Union Agreement to make it fit with the 21st century realities, and to align when it comes to green and digital transition related legislation, and the broader sustainable development to reach to the broader sustainable development objectives. And the standards and the perspective in the due diligence and the perspective in the OECD guidelines is surely something that we can work on, start working on already as a preparatory step for the broader customs union, new generation of the customs union agreement. Therefore, your input today is much appreciated. And I will also take the liberty as a moderator to ask you the first and very broad question. I'm aware it's going to be very broad, but could you please share with us the top 3 business concerns on the overall sustainability and due diligence initiatives at the moment? Because, I mean, because of the overlapping or at times simultaneous legislative work on different dossiers, I think there's a general theme coming forward in all those, and I would be very happy to hear about those.
I think the top concerns are 2. One is the overall administrative burdens, because all these proposals mean substantial cost and administrative burdens for companies, and I think that's a major issue, because it's not trivial at all. It is big. And the second point is coherence between the various initiatives. There is, for example, now this initiative on the corporate sustainable due diligence. There is the sustainable reporting. And there is also an initiative now on avoiding forced labor in the chain. Now, the system for the forced labor due diligence and the system for the general due diligence is completely different, because the general due diligence is process-oriented, whereas the forced labor due diligence is product-oriented. They focus on the product, and that can, in practice, that can be really problematic. So those are the 2 main concerns: administrative cost and consistency and coherence.
I know this is a broader discussion again on the on EU level, but in the last period, in the last 6 months or so, the Commission took note of the businesses' concerns in these terms. Do you think this will be, and they admitted that the competitiveness of the businesses and the burden reduction should be a priority for the new legislative period as well. Would you expect to see the reflection of this on the ongoing negotiations on due diligence in the upcoming months? Because we are running out of time when it comes to due diligence. We're almost there, I believe. So, I mean. Well,
I hope that it is taken into account. There has clearly been a shift in the policies of the Commission. As you mentioned, there is an increasing awareness in the Commission about the need for competitiveness. If you take a longer view, then you can see that in the previous Commission, which ended in 2019, there was a very clear focus on better regulation and on avoiding administrative burdens. It was a clear policy and it had results. In the Commission von der Leyen, which comes to an end next year, this focus on better regulation was almost absent. There were a few, say, token recognitions of it, but basically the policies that were developed were very burdensome for companies, and it was not much taken into account. So there is a change going on. It's too early to see what it will bring, but I think this changed focus, not only in the Commission, but also in part of the European Parliament, may have an influence on the last final equilibrium, say the last final compromise that must be reached in due diligence. So I hope it will have an influence, but we are not there yet.
Thank you. If we go back to the OECD guidelines, what would be your expectations from the perspective of level playing field globally? I mean, how do you expect it to impact different initiatives on global level?
Yeah. Well, the advantage from our point of view of the OECD as compared to the EU is, of course, that it has a much broader membership. It's Turkey, it's the US, it's Korea, Japan, and a series of other non-European countries. So by definition, OECD guidelines have a broader effect on the level playing field worldwide than EU legislation. At the same time, what we see is that a number of countries in the world, and especially the countries having a more autocratic approach, are resisting that, say, values from the OECD or from the EU are imposed on them. So we see a contradictory development in the world, that on the one hand, in one part of the world, the responsible business conduct demands are steadily increased, whereas in important partner countries, there is resistance against them. And that is a rather recent development, so you cannot come to a conclusion at this moment on how it will work out.
Okay, and in fact, we have already a question about the potential impact of the EU due diligence on the relations of the EU companies with the partners in the third countries. Because at the end, they're not going to be the ones who are reporting, maybe, but of course, the EU companies needs to turn to their partners to make sure that they're implementing the principles and the rules.
Yeah, yeah. So the situation will be that the EU legislation will demand of the bigger companies in Europe to completely comply with this new due diligence legislation. So they must have in place a due diligence process and a strategy. They must execute the strategy. They must report on it. They must make an analysis of their chain. And if they see that there are certain risks or certain problems, then they have to deal with them. So it's an extensive process. And there are huge fines. The final level is not yet determined, but it may be something like 4 or 5% of the global turnover. So in principle, there are huge fines, which means that you have to be certain as a company. And that means that every company will ask from every smaller company in its chain, EU company or Turkish company or other third country company, to comply with the due diligence rules. So it means that basically every company will be in the chain will be affected. At the same time, there are provisions on proportionality and on prioritization. And so in principle, there is a recognition in the EU proposal that you cannot ask the same thing from a small company with little leverage in the chain and with few people than you can ask from a big company with big leverage and many people. But still, it is not yet clear how hard legally these provisions on proportionality and prioritization will be. So that is one of the points which, in our view, is still not clear enough and which needs clarification, because I've said at the beginning, in principle, we agree to having European rules. They must be effective, but then business must also be able to implement them in practice. So there are still a number of open questions, but it is certain that from all companies, also small companies in the chain, an effort will be asked to do due diligence and to see whether there are no risks for the climate, risks for pollution, risks for social abuse or human rights abuse in the chain.
This is critical from the global perspective. Definitely, I mean, we talked about the competitiveness, and if we don't have workable solutions for businesses, we're also risking the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, because you need to set an example which is working as well at the end, and transition can only happen if it's a successful one for the.
No, and that is indeed, that is of course the construct and the constructive and the positive element, because we are in the lobbying process very much concentrating on the elements that have to improve and on the possible burdens. But on the other hand, it is of course true that there are certain abuses in the chains that you don't want to have, intrinsically because it's wrong, and also in the long run because they have an impact on the functioning of companies. If you have stable chains without abuses, there are also chains that in the long run will be more trustworthy, more reliable. So there is also a clear positive interest of companies to be involved in this effort.
Thank you, Winand. And now we have a question on the practical aspects. What would be your recommendations for the companies to adapt themselves to the emerging rules, let's say including the EU due diligence, OECD guidelines are approved, and what will be the main challenges on company level and how companies should address these?
Yeah. Well, I think even without knowing yet the exact meaning of the exact content of the European legislation, there is already a lot of international literature available on how to do due diligence and what is demanded in your chain. There are also a number of international institutions dealing with it. There are tools developed by governments, by all kinds of NGOs. So I think if a company wants to prepare itself for what's coming, there is already a lot of material available, even if you don't know the final details at this moment. So I think a general preparation process can already start. And also, of course, the OECD guidelines are already applicable since 2011. So many companies also already have started the process. One of the elements we have been very much promoting also in the framework of the EU legislation is to create the possibilities that industry level initiatives are taken so that companies together from one country, together from one sector, or also internationally in one sector, that you coordinate your efforts and that you make a joint effort together with stakeholders also to analyze your chain, to analyze certain risks, to see also where in the world are countries, say, relatively safe for certain risks and where there is an increased risk. So I think there is a lot of information available if you want to start the process.
Thank you, Winand. And now we have a question on the other dimensions other initiatives you mentioned in your question. So apart from the CSDDD, could you please elaborate on other legislative files you mentioned, CSRD, forced labor, and deforestation?
Yeah, for the CSRD, that's about reporting, about sustainability reporting. And the CSRD, in fact, consists of two elements. One is a directive on this matter, which has been agreed already. It's there. It has been concluded. The directive contains, say, more general rules. And on the basis of the directive, a so-called delegated act has been prepared. And in that delegated act, the specific reporting standards are defined. Now, the European Parliament has on the agenda, I think, next week to vote on the delegated act. And the delegated act is a Commission act, which is based on standards that have been developed by EFRAG, and EFRAG is a private institution making reporting standards, financial standards as well as sustainability reporting standards. There is still quite some discussion going on because the Delegated Act is very detailed. There are hundreds of points on which you have to report, and it will be a very substantial burden also for businesses. So it is in a very advanced stage. We still hope that some improvements can be made, be it in the Delegated Act or be it in the guidance that the Commission will develop to advise companies on how to implement the Delegated Act. But the CSRD is a very substantial reporting requirement on sustainability. And there is a close linkage also between the CSRD and the CSDDD, so the due diligence directive, because both, of course, deal to a large extent on the same sustainability dimensions of doing business. As far as the forced labor ban is concerned, the basic principle there is that it should not be it should be forbidden that certain products that are made with forced labor are on the market. So it's purely product oriented. It's not process oriented, as I said before, which means that if you would buy a product as a European company and you import it and you have it in the shelves in your shops, and suddenly it would be discovered that the product is linked to forced labor, that at that specific moment, then the product should be taken out of the market, which would, of course, imply a very substantial and very unpredictable financial burden. And that is one of our concerns, that it is, in a way, even if you did your due diligence and then it would be found out that there is a problem, then you can't say you still will have to do it even if you did the right due diligence. So it's a different system, and that is one of the challenges also, where we hope that more coherence in the two can be made.
Thank you, Winand. We also have a question on the implementation of CSDD and CSRD. Sorry, my screen just shifted. Yeah. Our audience wonders how the rules will be enforced that already falls into the scope of corporate sustainability reporting directive. The companies from outside the EU that falls into the scope of CSRD will be monitored. So how this will be enforced?
Yeah, I think both will be enforced by national supervisory authorities. So both are directives, the reporting directive and the due diligence directive, which means that the European Union determines the broad lines of the legislation, and the directive must always be implemented in every member state by a national legislative act. So by definition, there will be certain differences between the member states because it is national implementation legislation. And normally then also the national supervisory authority will be responsible for the implementation and also for the enforcement. In due diligence, the enforcement will in fact go via two tracks. One track is the national supervisory authority, which I just mentioned. Member states are free to determine themselves what national institution they will indicate as the supervisory authority. But in due diligence, there will also be the possibility that if the failure of doing due diligence causes damage, that then there would be a possibility for national liability via a civil tort law. So there would be a two-track approach. One would be administrative via the supervisor, and the other would be civil jurisdiction via tort law.
Thank you.
What the what the directive also envisages, and what national implementation laws may also envisage, is that the access to European courts for cases which play outside the EU but have a certain link with the EU via the due diligence could be brought to European courts, and that even also European law would be applicable. So that would mean a substantial extension of the possibilities to use civil jurisdiction.
That's a very critical detail. Thank you. Just one note on to our audience. There are some questions on CBAM, CBAM implementation. We will try to answer those later on in written format, because this falls out of the scope, as urgent and important it is. This falls out of the scope of this discussion. So I have one final question. You mentioned different practices in several EU member states. How can compliance with the directive achieved throughout the EU, and how long the process will last? How the harmonization among the different member states will take? And how much time do companies and the supply chain have to prepare?
Yeah. Well, first, the harmonization. That is one of our key issues now as Business Europe, to say if you want to introduce in the EU such an intrusive and such a consequential legislation, it has to be to a large extent harmonized. The definitions, the fines, the key provisions should all be harmonized over the whole of the EU. At the moment, this is not at all the case. And at the moment, the possibilities are left open that if the directive is agreed, that there can be that the member states and their implementation can add additional demands, which in our view would be unworkable, as I said before, because then any European company could come to a Turkish supplier and say, well, I would like to buy your products, but you have to comply with 27 European laws, which are different and maybe contradictory. So that's a major concern. Politically, it's very difficult because the Commission is not willing to do it. The Parliament is explicitly against it, and the member states are divided. But that is one element where we think it is absolutely essential that more progress is made and that more harmonization is achieved. And what was the second part of your question?
How much time companies will have to adapt to the new?
Yeah, so that already also is not yet clear, because there are different proposals in the three different texts that are available now. But the idea is that once the directive is agreed, that there is then 1 or 2 years before it enters into force. And then it would enter into force cascading, so that first I think companies up to 3,000 FTEs, and then it goes down to 2,000 and 1,000. I don't know the exact number, but there would be a cascading that in 4 years it would go down to, I think, all companies above 500 FTEs. But
perfect. Thank you very much, Rina. This shows also the how complicated the legislative processes in the EU are, especially on the technical files, and we would highly appreciate, we would very happy if you join us again once the due diligence on EU level is clarified, once we have the final text. So thank you very much. We are right on time. Thank you very much for your valuable insights, Rina. This was extremely helpful. Like I said, I also made a lot of notes, even though we're following this subject. And thank you once again.
Okay, well, it was a pleasure to be here, and I'm always willing to come back.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Sayın katılımcılar, aynı zamanda cevaplayamadığımız sorular varsa tekrar soruların üstünden geçeceğiz ve size yazılı olarak bu sorulara cevap vermeye çaba harcayacağız. Tekrar katkılarınız için çok teşekkürler. Yeniden görüşmek dileğiyle.